You got basketball coming up tonight. Hawks at the Cavs, Pelicans at the Clippers as we bring in the commissioner, of the NBA, Adam Silver. Commissioner, how are you this morning?
Hey, Dan, I'm great. How are you?
What game are you going to tonight?
Just watching on TV tonight.
I was wondering where you went to school, how that affected you as far as wanting to do this job or being involved in the NBA. Because you go to Duke and then the University of Chicago. Duke in the early 80s, and then University of Chicago when Michael Jordan gets to town. How much of an impact did that have on you wanting to do this?
It's such an interesting question. Duke had a huge impact on me wanting to do this. I'd say when I went down to Duke, I grew up in New York. I was a Knicks fan growing up, but I wasn't a huge college basketball fan. And then when I got to Duke, it was Coach K's first year in 1980. And at least then, I mean, the good and bad news was the teams weren't great. You didn't have to sleep outside and paint your face to go to a game. So it suited me well. But I really fell in love with the program there. And then you're exactly right. Then I went to University of Chicago Law School. Michael had come a few years earlier. I think I got there in 85. So right around the same time Michael came. And again, same thing, Michael was a phenom, but they weren't winning in those early years. You could just go to the old Bull Stadium, 10 minutes before the game, buy a ticket and go. So used to go with my law school friends. And that, I remember early days there, the Bulls, you thought you were experiencing something pre-internet, everything else that no one else sort of understood. Like you felt like you were in this special club watching Michael Jordan and those teams. So, and even then I'll say though, when I then finished law school, worked for a judge, worked at a law firm in New York, it never occurred to me that I'd have a career in sports.
But then you went to NBA Entertainment?
So what happened was I'd been practicing law for a couple of years, and David Stern had worked at the same law firm my father had worked at. I didn't know him, and I wrote him a letter, not thinking I would work at the NBA, but asking for advice on how to transition from being a lawyer into doing something else. I was actually most interested in media. One of the clients of our law firm was HBO, and I was spending a lot of time working on media cases. And David ended up meeting with me, pre-email, old-fashioned letter saying, "Dear Commissioner Stern." I ended up meeting with him a month or so later. He gave me some advice, and then several months after that, his assistant called me and said, "If you have time, he'd like to see you." I said, "Of course." And I didn't understand what he had in mind when we first met, but as it turned out, he wanted to hire an assistant. So that was my first job as the special assistant to the commissioner, and that was 1992.
How many days in before he yelled at you?
Half
a day. I was there one time. He wanted to meet, and he was in another part of his office, and I heard him yelling, like at the top of his lungs. And I'm sitting there, and I'm going, "Oh, my God, I'm in trouble." He came out, and he would go, "Those bleeping contractors." He goes, "I'm trying to get work done at my house." He goes, "Hey, Patrick, how are you?" I'm going, "Oh, my God." Like he just snapped right into just being a normal, regular guy.
No one was immune from it. I think he would have made it about 15 minutes with a modern HR department these days. But he was equal opportunity, whether it was his contractor or an NBA owner. That's who he was. I mean, he brought a lot of passion to everything. I miss him every day, but it was a different time, and then CEOs, commissioners. I mean, it was a full frontal assault being yelled at by David. It literally, like, physically, he wasn't that big a guy, but he was broad-shouldered, and it would knock you back when he would yell.
Were you involved in The Last Dance, the Jordan documentary?
I was very involved. In fact, I was the president of NBA Entertainment during Michael's last season on the Bulls, when we went to first Jerry Reinsdorf and then Phil Jackson to get permission to do that. And then I was the one sent to convince Michael what our agreement was at the time, and we knew each other well because I was head of NBA Entertainment, was let's, on a handshake, agree to allow us to be a fly on the wall. And I'll commit to you that this footage, in those days it was film, and NBA Entertainment out in Secaucus will physically keep it in a different place in our library, and we'll never use it unless we jointly agree we can do something with it. And so and then of course then he retired. He came back at one point. We had many conversations over the years with different potential directors, and he never quite warmed up to making it. And then, whenever that was 5 years ago or so, that some of his longtime colleagues, Curtis Polk, S.D. Portnoy, others, went to him and said, "It's time. There's a generation out there who understand you as a brand, and you have shoes and the Jordan brand and all that, but never understood who you were and what you brought to the game." And I think that moved him. And ultimately, we went out, hired a new director. It was sort of joint production with a group, and obviously then ESPN in the middle of the pandemic, accelerated it, recognized there was an opportunity. Then it went to Netflix, but it was a fascinating process over many years to make that documentary. And by the way, Dan, when we made it, there was no one had suggested a documentary back then or presentation was more than 2 hours. It was unheard, right? You followed someone for a year, but like a documentary, and the only real outlets back then, it was HBO, maybe some sort of film festival or something for a documentary. Maybe it would go to home video, but it was a 2 hour, essentially maybe 2.5 hour presentation. And it wasn't until years and years later that people had this sense that you could do multi-parts, 10 hours, 12 hours, whatever else. I mean, that nobody, as you know, thought in those terms back then.
But I'm a conspiracy theorist here. It felt like the timing of this, LeBron had just won another championship, and it felt like, let's, and you know how competitive Jordan is, let's remind everybody of why I'm the greatest of all time, and it comes out at the time that LeBron wins a championship. So let me present that storyline to you, Commissioner.
I don't think Michael is immune from hearing about other potential goats out there. It was never said directly, but I think has to be a part of him that as he's watching the game today and the way he approached it, every minute of every game, the number of minutes he played. He had seasons where he averaged over 40 minutes. I remember in those days, again, because I was at NBA Entertainment and doing the television stuff, that he felt an obligation to play every game.
Yeah.
I mean, he knew, not just for a television audience, but he knew, and every time he played, there were families, there were others who had saved their money, potentially scalped the ticket in those days, as they called it, to see Michael Jordan play. And I think he personally felt that. It weighed heavily on him. Maybe there were even times he played that maybe doctors didn't want him to play. But as you know, it was a different time.
But, I look at Zion Williamson this year. Let's go back to Michael's second year where he breaks his foot. He wouldn't play in today's NBA, right? The Celtics series, which I think was the coming out party for Michael Jordan, was that series in the Garden when he put up 63. That wouldn't have happened. And I know that we're trying to incentivize, and what do you do to get players to play more games? And Mike would have been held out probably the whole season, I'm going to imagine, in today's NBA.
I think that's right. I mean, and I'll just say you got to find the right balance, because there's also players, former great players who you and I both know, who are somewhat hobbled today because maybe they played at times they shouldn't have. So, I think your word incentives is the right one, because I think there are situations today where, even aside from injuries, where, load management, as they call it these days, we're perfectly healthy players. Somebody at a team can tell you on November 15th that on January 19th, this player will not be playing in this game because our program suggests that would not be good for his health. And I think that it's more of an art than people acknowledge sometimes. There's the suggestion it's pure science, and we know will reduce injuries by a player not playing in that game. Now, of course, if you play in fewer games, maybe decreases the likelihood that you'll get injured. But it's the right balance, because players understand it's a business too. They're entertainers. Yes, people who are rooting for that team want that team to optimize that player on the floor and not overdo it. But at the same time, these guys are paid an enormous amount of money to play this game. And it's a little out of skew right now. There's no question. And I think I mentioned it the other day when I was doing some media about what it is we need to do working with the Players Association to create greater incentives for guys to play a full complement of games, but not push to that point where, as maybe happened in the old days, where guys truly felt they needed to play through actual injuries and maybe shorten their careers.
Well, what about minimum games to be eligible for postseason honors?
I think that's a good idea. I think that's something we should look at. I think that would be a way to incentivize guys. I think there's an expectation that if you are going to be an MVP or whatever that award is.
Well, even first team, second team, third team, all NBA.
Yeah. Sure. I agree with you. I think it's a good suggestion. I think it's something we're going to be going into collective bargaining fairly soon. And my sense is it's something that in the aggregate, most players would think is a good idea too. I mean, the conversation we're having is not all that different than the one I have with individual players. I mean, I think they're fans of the game. They want to see guys on the floor. And in fairness to the players, in many cases, it's the teams. These load management programs are coming from our teams, not the players. So it's often a trainer who is saying to a player, and by the way, I've had this conversation with Michael Jordan, and he thought at the time that he was more likely to get injured if he sat out a game. Like he thought, like, if he got out of his rhythm, that might lead to an injury. So while he felt that obligation to the fans, and what was different too in those days, there were games, and every game didn't get the scrutiny it got now, but maybe it was a game that certainly wasn't on national television, less important competitively, but he would start. They may take him out. He'd start the third quarter. But for a fan who was there tuning in or in that arena, maybe their only chance to see Michael Jordan, he made sure that he was on the floor.
We're talking to the NBA Commissioner, Adam Silver. We got games coming up tonight. You got the Hawks at the Cavaliers, Pelicans at the Clippers. All right, this is something I'm sure that you have not been addressed or have addressed or been bothered by, but it bothers me. Do we just decide now that you can't carry the basketball, palm the basketball in the NBA? Like, we've moved on that you're allowed to do that, Commissioner?
Interesting you should ask. So I've had this conversation with Monty McCutcheon, who's the head of officiating. And the players cover so much ground now. They're so skilled. It's a tough call to make, first of all. I think it may be that the rule needs to be changed, because the way the rule is now written is that you can't put your hand under the ball, completely under the ball, or bring it to a pause. I think in some cases, if you really broke it down, the player's hand is actually on the side of the ball, not under the ball. And that crossover happens so quickly and there's no pause. I'm not sure if technically, I don't think palming is the word in our rule book, but I don't think, as you and I are describing it, that it's technically a violation. There's no doubt our officials miss it sometimes, but I know that plenty of fans, when I'm in the seats, will say to me, "Isn't that palming?" They're going like this.
Yeah.
Now, our officials are looking for the pause, and they're looking to see. I think, clearly, if there's that so-called frozen moment, they should be calling it. But it is an area of attention for our officiating staff.
I know. It's the little things that bother me, Commissioner. What would expansion hinge on? I saw where Seattle's mayor talked about, sources or Las Vegas is a possibility. What would be the time frame? What would hinge on expanding?
There's no clear sort of benchmark to get there. Part of it is I think a sense of the governors, the old owners of the teams, as to their view of when it makes sense to grow the enterprise. I mean, to me, there's two core issues. One is the economics, of course, and that if you expand, the way I think of the league, there are 30 teams, there are 30 shareholders, and you're really selling equity. If you just, let's say we were expand by an even number, then the extent you're growing, things get divided 1/32nd instead of 1/30th. And so then it's the time value of money. If you, whatever the values you get for that expansion team, what's the cost of that equity that you're selling and the value of it? So that's one way we look at it. I think the other is the competition on the floor. And what's interesting in this league is that even where, like another global sport, soccer, where there's multiple great leagues around the world, the Bundesliga, La Liga, the English Premier League, all top-notch leagues. In basketball, everyone would acknowledge there's one league at the top of the pyramid globally, it's the NBA. Yet even with all the very best players in the world coming to this league, a game played by tens of millions of kids around the world, you still don't have the kind of competitive parity that we would like. You and I both know you could start the season and you could say there's a large group of teams that in all likelihood aren't going to win the championship. Or if you looked at a Vegas board or something, you'd see where the odds are. And if you expand, you're diluting talent even more. So that is a factor we look at. And I think it's in the part of the mindset of the existing teams, how that will work. Having said all that, I think enterprises naturally grow over time. And there's no doubt Seattle would be a great market. Las Vegas would be a great market. There's state-of-the-art arenas in both those communities. And so we'll look at it. It's interestingly, it's not on the front burner for our league right now. And also we're going to go through a new collective bargaining negotiation. I also think there's a lot of uncertainty in the media world right now. All these new streaming platforms potentially interested in sports. So it's hard to set the right value. I think that's something we're going to monitor as well. So nothing will happen in the short or medium term, but we'll turn back to it at some point.
Great to catch up with you. Good luck in the postseason, and thanks for joining us as always.
Yeah, thank you, Dan.
That's the commissioner, Adam Silver.